Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Monday, June 3rd, and it's day 241 since October 7th. Quite significantly, the United Nations is warning of rising temperatures and the way that they're affecting people in Gaza, specifically that rising temperatures are worsening the humanitarian crisis there. The lack of clean drinking water has become a top concern as temperatures get hotter and Palestinians are facing increased dehydration and the spread of infectious disease. The World Health Organization has warned that cases of hepatitis A, diarrhea, other waterborne illnesses, diseases like cholera could quickly become more prevalent without improved access to clean water. Humanitarian organizations in Gaza have reported that aid shipments into South Gaza are being displaced increasingly by commercial convoys amidst Israel's military push into Rafah. That's been reported widely. And we heard this directly on the ground when we were in Israel, that privatization, private companies are being reported to not only be privileged in being allowed access. The US administration has said sometimes they have their own security forces, but we've heard from international NGOs that a lot of times the products that they have are sodas or candy or things that have low nutritional value, and it's not what's most needed in Gaza. And that's not being widely reported. Despite UN data showing a 2/3 drop in aid deliveries, Israeli officials claim the overall number of trucks entering into Gaza has increased in May compared to April. Of course, these numbers are still woefully inadequate. The discrepancy in numbers is attributed to the rise in commercial shipments. There was a ban on food sales in Gaza from Israel and the West Bank that was lifted. Aid agencies warn that the prioritization of commercial trucks over humanitarian aid is critically undermining efforts to address the escalating hunger crisis in Gaza. In terms of the hostage and ceasefire negotiations, we heard about President Biden's, laying down the gauntlet. Yesterday, Prime Minister Netanyahu said Israel will not be changing their war plans and that they are still determined to completely destroy Hamas. Nonetheless, Prime Minister Netanyahu met with the far-right National Security Minister of Israel, Ben-Gvir, to discuss the plan that was proposed by Biden for ceasefire and hostage release. This was after Ben-Gvir announced that he would bring the government down if Israel accepted the agreement. Following the meeting, Netanyahu said that the Biden deal would not end the war, but would lead to a, quote, temporary ceasefire to release the hostages held by Hamas, end quote. Far-right Finance Minister Smotrich threatened to replace the failed leadership of Israel if the Biden proposal was adopted. He added that Israel's green light, given by the War Cabinet, did not have the authority and would be in violation of the law. He said it would not be binding for the Israeli government and the state of Israel. Smotrich further threatened to stand against Netanyahu with all of our strength and aggression if he were to choose surrender and defeat. So quite a bit of discord within the Israeli government about the proposed plan. The chairman of the ultra-Orthodox United Torah Judaism Party and the coalition minister, his name is Goldknopf, he said his party would support any deal for the return of the hostages. And President Biden was scheduled to speak later on today, Monday, with the Emir of Qatar to discuss efforts to finalize that three-stage ceasefire deal. U.S. National Security spokesperson John Kirby said that mediators are still awaiting official responses from Hamas. He said that this deal or this proposal gives them what they're looking for, which is a ceasefire, and over time and through the phases, the potential withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. Just a reminder, Hamas has been very consistent. They have said consistently they will not release any further hostages unless there is a permanent ceasefire on the table. They've said, why would we release hostages and then have continued war? Israel has said, or Netanyahu has said, we want the hostages to be released and then we're going to continue until Hamas is destroyed. And it seems like this is still at an impasse. So hopefully they will be able to negotiate beyond this. But at least from what we're hearing publicly in the news, it seems like that's still where there is disagreement. Kirby also said that President Biden made the proposed public announcement to try to energize the process and catalyze a different outcome, but that he was not about jamming Israel's prime minister or the war cabinet. This was about laying bare for the public to see how well and how faithfully and how assertively the Israelis came up with the proposal, which honestly made me laugh out loud. but I'll leave that for now. Egypt's foreign ministry said that Hamas had considered the proposal presented by Biden to be positive, but they're waiting for Israel's reply. But Hamas sources did say that they had pessimism and concerns following reports about the disagreements in Israel related to the complete ceasefire, which were the comments that I just shared. Hamas told Qatari and Egyptian mediators that it demands U.S. guarantees that Israel will uphold all of the phases of the agreement, emphasizing a halt to fighting, according to Lebanese newspapers. And according to the report, Egyptian mediators asked Hamas to also send representatives of some of the other factions that are present in Gaza, such as the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, to ensure that they also would be willing to accept the terms of the deal. So one of the challenges in Israel is that members of the Israeli government are refusing also to meet with members of hostages. This is something that we heard quite significantly. U.S. officials have met with hostages more than Israeli officials. We know this for a fact. National Security Minister Ben-Gvir evaded meeting with relatives of hostages at the Knesset, claiming that he meets with hostages' families all the time. Alana was one of the hostages who was released from Hamas captivity, and she yelled at the minister and said, "I'm good enough to sit in a tunnel with Hamas, but I'm not good enough for you to meet with." One of the questions on the table also related to Gaza is what happens after a ceasefire agreement. Who will be the governing authority in terms of, post-war? In response to that question, Israel's defense minister outlined a framework for a governing alternative to Hamas in the Gaza Strip. After a briefing at the military Southern Command yesterday, the minister Gallant said in a statement that the country's defense establishment was considering how to create a new post-war administration in the Palestinian enclave. And this is what he said. This is a direct quote. He said, "We will isolate areas, remove Hamas operatives from those areas, and introduce forces that will enable an alternative government to form, an alternative that threatens Hamas," end quote. Now, he didn't offer any further details, but then he said it will create the potential for a governing alternative. So this raises significant concerns. One of the U.S.'s requirements is that Israel would not have a permanent presence in Gaza. Certainly the Palestinian Authority and other Palestinians do not want a permanent Israeli presence in Gaza, but there's no alternative that has been suggested as of yet. And Gallant's response doesn't give any indication of what the Israelis are thinking in that regard. The Israeli Defense Forces announced that they found the remains of a body of Dolev Yahud, who was considered to be held hostage in Gaza, but they were actually found in kibbutz near Oz. Later, that was actually today, Kibbutz Nirim announced that another one of the hostages, Nadav Popplewell, who was taken captive by Hamas on October 7th, was actually killed during captivity. And we have heard reports in Israel that families and others have been suspicious of when reports come in of how hostages have died, were they killed in captivities by bombings, or what actually has happened. Other news from Gaza, there have been satellite images and a probe by the Israeli Defense Forces that the IDF failed to properly evaluate potential lethal repercussions of last week's strike on 2 senior Hamas officials in the city of Rafah, which led to the death of at least 40 Palestinians. As of today, the death toll in Gaza is 36,479 Palestinians, and those wounded is at 82,777 at least since October 7th in Gaza. The Israeli Defense Forces have said that they're conducting criminal investigations into 48 cases of deaths of Gaza residents who have died while in Israeli prisons since the beginning of the war. The military police have opened at least 70 criminal investigations into soldiers' conducts related to cases that involved looting, weapon theft, violence, or insubordination. And then just a few other updates. Escalations or hostilities have continued on the northern border of Israel and South Lebanon. The IDF has said 30 rockets were fired at northern Israel from South Lebanon, and fires have continued in northern Israel after rocket attacks. An IDF facility was reportedly hit, and the IDF said fighter jets struck a rocket launcher and buildings used by Hezbollah in several villages in South Lebanon. There still continues to be significant displacement in South Lebanon and in northern Israel. And then in Syria, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reported that there was a strike in Aleppo where 16 people were killed. It says that they were 16 members of an Iran-affiliated militia. But that report just came through today as well. In the West Bank, undercover officers assassinated a wanted senior operative in an unnamed militant organization in Nablus, according to Israeli police. And the Palestinian Red Crescent Society reported that 6 people were wounded in exchange of fire, including a 13-year-old Palestinian boy. On Capitol Hill, House Republicans have released an annual spending bill for the State Department and foreign operations. The text will not make it into law, but consistently serves on messaging related to foreign policy. And what's significant about this is it prohibits the admission and resettlement of any Palestinian refugees from Gaza, but it also calls for a permanent ban on U.S. funding for UNRWA, the UN Refugee Agency for Palestinian refugees. And finally, many of you know Churches Middle East Peace's partner, the Nasser family from the Tent of Nations. I wanted to be sure to give you an update about them. You know, with all eyes focused on Gaza, many have not been paying attention or have missed things happening in the West Bank. Since March of this year, Israelis have started construction of 2 roads on the private property of the farm, and a 3rd road that will encroach on their land if the construction continues. They've appealed to the Supreme Court, which had previously ruled that the land was not to be touched. On April 21st of this year, the Supreme Court issued an order preventing the state from doing anything until further orders, but Israelis have continued to enter and to work on the land as recently as May 31st. In the meantime, there appears to be a new settlement outpost where Israeli settlers placed an RV directly abutting the Nasser family land. And in addition, like many, many other Palestinian farmers, the Nassers have faced additional restrictions on accessing their land, regular intimidation, harassment by Israeli soldiers and settlers as they're trying to farm. And so they have been so grateful for the accompaniment of regular visitors and internationals who are staying at the farm. So if you're interested in doing that, please reach out to them. They have been in the midst of a 34-year-old legal struggle to re-register their land as required by Israeli law, since their property is located in Area C of the occupied West Bank, and their next court hearing is on July 2nd, 2024. So please add that date to your calendars. Pray for the Nasser family that they might be able to re-register their land. Pray for a just outcome, protection of their family and their community, for Palestinian farmers throughout the West Bank. But contact the Nassers if you're interested in going there to serve. And may we continue in our journey together towards peace, an end to all violence, prevention of further genocide in Gaza, as we continue with faith, love, and hope. Amen.